studios of Penn State Public Broadcasting, tonight's program is part of WPSU's Common Ground Lobby Talk series. Here's host Patty Satalia.
Imagine what life would be like if for months at a time you found it difficult, sometimes impossible, to breathe. The Chesapeake Bay, the largest estuary in the United States and one of the most complex ecosystems on Earth, is suffocating from the combined impacts of farming, urban development, and population growth. Good evening and welcome to WPSU's Common Ground Lobby Talk, the Chesapeake Bay. I'm Patty Satalia. Threading through a watershed that stretches across parts of 6 states, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, and West Virginia, are about 150 major rivers and streams that eventually flow into the Chesapeake Bay. What happens in those watersheds is contributing to the bay's decline. We'll talk about the threats, about current efforts underway to save the bay, and about what more needs to be done. And our studio audience is invited to join the conversation. Now let's meet our guest. Kristen Saki-Blanc is the director of Penn State's Agriculture and Environment Center. Also with us is Matt Earhart, executive director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Pennsylvania. Rich Batouk is Associate Director of Science at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Chesapeake Bay Program Office. And Denise Heller-Wardrop is Associate Director of the Penn State Cooperative Wetlands Center and the Pennsylvania Governor's appointee to the Chesapeake Bay Program Science and Technical Advisory Committee. Thank you all so much for joining us. I don't think there's a person here who hasn't enjoyed the Chesapeake Bay in one way or another, but I'd like to begin with you, Matt, to describe for us why the Chesapeake Bay is so important, so vital economically, socially, and environmentally.
Well, as you mentioned, the Chesapeake Bay is one of the largest estuaries in the world. It's a very complex estuary, and it's also an economic driver for the region and particularly for Maryland and Virginia. We have major ports in Norfolk and Baltimore. We have tremendous fishery industries there. We have just an unbelievable tourism industry, as well as the increase in value of all the surrounding real estate that comes from the Chesapeake Bay. And it's an ecosystem that, were it fully functional, would increase the economic value of the region by trillions of dollars. So it's not just a cost when we talk about improving it. There's a real financial gain at the end of the tunnel. I think one of the things that's most important to remember is the Chesapeake Bay has a 64,000 square mile watershed. It has the highest ratio of land area to water of any estuary in the world. So what we do through that entire watershed from Virginia to New York has a tremendous impact on the water quality of the local streams and downstream in the Chesapeake. So it's not just a bay that's south of the Mason-Dixon line, it's a bay from Cooperstown, New York, down to Virginia.
We mentioned parts of 6 states in the District of Columbia having an impact on this estuary. Tell us a little bit, Denise, about the impact that Pennsylvania in particular has on it.
Well, Pennsylvania, most of the state is in the Susquehanna watershed, and the Susquehanna delivers over 50% of the freshwater flow to the bay. So it's the largest single tributary. And again, most of Pennsylvania is in the Susquehanna River Basin. And so what we do upstream in that watershed ultimately delivers a lot of the water to the bay, but then there's also a lot of considerations about what we do up there for the health of our own watersheds. But clearly the largest basin or the largest tributary to the Chesapeake.
The Chesapeake Bay was once a resilient ecosystem, and we now know that it's really a fragile body of water that needs constant care. Give us an idea of what the status is and how we got into the situation we're in right now.
Well, Patty, over the last 25 years of the restoration effort, we've seen some small successes, but right now, majority of the Chesapeake is degraded. It doesn't have enough oxygen to support our fish, crabs, and oysters. It has cloudy waters that doesn't support our underwater grasses. And unfortunately, we have harmful algal blooms that prevent us from either drinking the water or swimming in the Chesapeake itself. Unfortunately, the Chesapeake has seen sort of 400 years of man activity on the Chesapeake. We've been working for the last quarter century to get her stabilized, as you say, back to a healthy ecosystem. We still got a long ways to go. Just as one example, since 1950, we've doubled our population from 8 million people to more than 16 million people. 50 years doubling a population, a tremendous amount of pressure on the 150 rivers that you mentioned that that flow into the Chesapeake, much less the ecosystem itself.
Three of the things we're worried about, in particular, Kristen, are phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment. Who are the major contributors? And not to say that we all have some role in this, but tell us who the major contributors are.
I think for Pennsylvania, the sources of nitrogen and phosphorus are primarily municipal wastewater treatment plants, and also through direct discharges, direct point source discharges to the streams. And on a non-point source level, which means it's not being directly emitted into the stream, but it's being released on grounds, it includes the farms, agriculture, croplands, barnyards, pasture areas. Pretty much anywhere that you have manure or fertilizers, you're going to have nitrogen and phosphorus. And if it's released into the environment and it rains, then there's travel of these nutrients over the surface of the ground and through the groundwater into the streams. Another source that sometimes we don't talk about quite as much is the atmospheric deposition of nutrients. And that comes from ammonia emissions from farms, but it also comes from the NOx emissions from cars. So that's where kind of the population piece fits in. In addition, any kind of land conversions that we're having for construction and changes from one land use to another as that ground is turned up for building new buildings, commercial areas, all of that has potential to release both sediments and the nutrients that those sediments carry with it to waterways. So we've got a number of sources, and agriculture is a big source, but so are the municipal sources, municipal wastewater treatment plants, some industrial wastewater treatment plants as well.
I want to talk more about those in just a minute, but the Chesapeake Bay Program, which the EPA administers, has been working on this since 1983, 25 years, and many figured that by now, or by the target date of 2010, this would be mostly solved. And I think we're all seeing that this is far from solved.
Exactly, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your efforts and how what you're doing differs from what the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is doing.
Yeah, Patty, I would put it as our efforts. It's 6 states, as you mentioned, that parts of 6 states that come into the Chesapeake itself. 1,650 different local governments out there, watershed organizations. Everyone really has a part of it in addition to the federal government. I agree with you that 25 years at this task, one would say, hey, you should be showing a lot more than the Chesapeake coming back in a degraded state. If you give it a grade, it may be like a C- or a D out there. Who would want a failing grade or close to a failing grade after 25 years? I think, as I mentioned, we have certainly seen some progress. Pennsylvania, for example, is certainly, the Susquehanna itself is cleaner than it was 25 years ago. But we're also seeing signs that that increasing population, it's a beautiful part of the country, the Mid-Atlantic, the reason why we're here in this part of Happy Valley, et cetera, that population growth is turning back some of the progress we've made to date. So clearly we know what the problems are. We've got a lot more work to do.
Okay, and how does it differ from what the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is doing?
Well, I think as an advocacy group, it's our job to, I mean, the easy part is to prod and push and try to keep the process moving along. I think the part that we've worked much more diligently on recently is to also try to bring different sorts of solutions to the table. So I think we do play a different role than the government agencies, and as Rich said, there's been tremendous progress in some sectors. The problem was that it's such a huge problem and such a large amount of work that needs to be done that you can make a lot of progress and still have pretty far to go.
Now, Rich mentioned the fact that it's an attractive place to be, and so lots of us want to move there, and we've seen the population literally double in the last 40 years from, I think, 8 million to 16 million, and I was just there this past weekend, and there's no sign of that stopping. You talked about wastewater plants, and it seems to be that we're making a lot of progress in that respect, but I'm wondering what, if anything, we're doing in terms of development and what impact that has on wetlands, which are so important to the ability of the bay to clean itself. Because they don't just flush away, which is what everyone assumes, that these wastes just flush away all on their own.
Right, and I was, as Matt was responding, I was thinking that, you know, there's been a role of science as well. So science has learned a lot about lag times, about the time between management actions and when you can expect to see something improve in the bay. We've learned a lot about that. We've learned a lot about what to do to help contribute to the solution in terms of best management practices. But the extent of the ongoing pressure is hard to imagine. So there is 100 acres of forest land converted every day in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. That pressure's really quite unbelievable. And so when you look at the gains we've made, it's hard to lose sight of the fact that those gains are sometimes swamped by just an increasing pressure.
It's a moving target. You set your targets for phosphorus and nitrogen, and then, you know, about 500,000 more people move in, and the game changes.
You look at Pennsylvania alone in terms of, you know, it's sort of everyone says it's somebody else's responsibility. Certainly, you can look at the wastewater treatment plants, about 200 major facilities out there that we're trying to take sort of their fair share of it. Now you need to increase rates to pay for local improvements to their local streams and also for the Chesapeake itself, but that's only about 14 to 20%, whether it's nitrogen and phosphorus. You look at our farmers up here, we've got about 44,000 farmers in the Susquehanna and Potomac parts of the drainage in Pennsylvania. Certainly, each one of those farmers, he and she needs to do certain practices, not only for the economic viability of those farms, but for their local streams and drinking water in the Chesapeake. But then individuals can do things as well. And you've got to look at the millions of people that live here in the Susquehanna watershed saying, what am I doing every day that I can do differently? It's not just the farmers, it's not just people that are on a wastewater treatment plant. If I've got a septic system, or if I've got a roof that's sort of draining off into my local stream, can I put a rain barrel there? Can I do something different? Can I change my driving habits to make a small but important contribution?
And I also wanted to add a little bit to that to get actually back to wetlands a little bit, in that we actually, Pennsylvania permits less than 70 acres of wetland a year. So that means that we've really turned down the spigot on how much we're losing. And I think the state does a good job of that. We're also in the Bay watershed 50% of the way to our wetland restoration goal. But one of the things that we forget about is that the wetlands that are remaining are somewhat compromised in their ability to function, and that's because of what's going on around them. And so that's really how the continuing development pressure, even though we may not be losing wetland area, we're compromising the existing system's ability to deal with the nutrient input and sediment input.
We're going to come back in a moment and take our first question from the audience, but first, our camera crew took a first-hand look at what's happening in the Chesapeake Bay from the eyes of the watermen who are working there. And while things may look fine to the casual observer, they don't look fine to them. Let's have a look.
I've seen some really good times as far as abundance of seafood, and I've seen some very hard times. There's a lot of species right now that I made a lot of money off of over the years that I can't even harvest anymore. It had nothing to do with us catching them. It has to do with the dams and the restrictions in the waterways and the pollution.
We're the dumping grounds for so many states. And I'm not sure that people really realize what goes on and how serious it is. I mean, I personally don't see the bay getting any cleaner whatsoever. Absolutely none. You know, I said over harvesting, it may play a small part in it. But Mother Nature runs in cycles. People have seen it in every aspect of work.
It always had to do with an environmental problem when you had ups and downs or natural cycles things. So we learned to live within that natural cycle. The problem that we see now, those cycles, instead of being 7 years apart or 10, 12, 15 years apart, they get longer and longer apart, and your good years get shorter and shorter and your bad years get longer and longer. I've got boat payments, I've got insurance, I've got slip rent, I've got upkeep on that boat. I can't go get a job $10 or $15 or $20 an hour and pay for all that. And I can't sell it. When things are lean, nobody's going to buy it for what it's worth, or even half what it's worth. So watermen are stuck in that job because they've got their whole life investment in their equipment. And they've got their whole education in that job. But we don't want to do nothing else either, so that's part of it. I still look around me and I still see lots of watermen working and still dealing with it and still surviving and complaining, but they're still there and they're still doing it. And it's because it's what they love and what they like and what they got all their investment in. Bay is good. Mother Nature's good. She can fix it if we just stop killing it. If we stopped doing everything right now and no more people came and you could move the people back away from the water, this bay would be teeming with the energy in another 12 months.
The bay needs to be cleaned up. The oysters will probably survive better. The crabs will do better. The fish will do better. Everything. It'll be a cyclone effect that'll happen so fast if they start to clean the bay. And I'm not blaming it on the chicken farmers. I'm not blaming it on the fertilizer companies. I mean, the biggest thing is people. That's going to be the biggest hurdle to get over. And then maybe some ways of life have to be changed.
I think man's smart enough to not let that happen, but he's taking too long to turn it around, and he's going to have a harder job turning around. I always say you pay now or you pay later, and when you pay later, you pay twice as much.
Chesapeake Bay is not only to the water, but Chesapeake Bay is for everyone. Anyone is welcome to come down and use the bay. It's for everybody. I mean, it's important to me. It's the life for so many people. I mean, so many people derive income from the bay. So many people derive pleasure from the bay. I mean, the bay is a beautiful place. Just look at it. I mean, you know, there's one Chesapeake Bay, one type of this estuary in the entire United States. I mean, anybody in the United States knows the Chesapeake Bay. That should say it all right there. You know, let's go ahead and take care of it.
They've given us a lot to talk about, and I want to follow up on some of what was presented in that piece, but I want to begin with a question from the audience. Do you have a question for our panel?
Yes. I'm concerned about the impact, both financial and technical, on local sewage treatment facilities. It's one thing to mandate an effluent limit. It's another thing to put it into place. And you mentioned some large facilities out there. There's some very small ones too that are fighting this.
As you mentioned, here in Pennsylvania, it's unique. You all have not just large facilities like that might service Harrisburg, but a lot of small ones for your townships, your boroughs and stuff out there. And certainly understand that people are paying increased sewer rates out there. But it's not just for the Chesapeake, that improvements that are made to local sewage treatment plants protect your local waters, your streams, your rivers, where you drink, where you fish, where you recreate, etc. So we certainly understand that that's an important. But I think also when folks are looking at their own piece, and they got to also look at their downstream neighbors, both in Pennsylvania and your neighbors to the south in Maryland, Virginia, that are also paying increased rates or actually having to do more than you all up in Pennsylvania because they actually contribute more to that problem. One of the things we're trying to do is to work with Pennsylvania, and they've got a program set up to provide options to the local governments to perhaps trade if they can't upgrade their particular treatment plant with their local farmers or with others out there. So try to find cost-effective ways of reducing the impact on local streams, at the same time helping the Chesapeake by reducing pollutant loads.
There are a number of municipalities in Pennsylvania who are actually considering suing EPA because they don't think that it's a fair and equitable cleanup plan, that the waste treatment plants are being unfairly burdened, that if they reduce, and in fact they've actually done better than a lot of the other people who are putting a burden on the bay, but that at 1/5 of the nitrogen and phosphorus coming from them, they're being unduly burdened. Other states also have grants and financial support to do what we're being asked to do in Pennsylvania. Is that forthcoming funding to make it more possible?
Well, first I want to get back at the concern about their fair share and stuff. What Pennsylvania did working with the municipalities is looked at the total pollutant burden coming from wastewater treatment plants, both the small and large facilities. As you said, about a fifth of the load came through. Therefore, they asked those same municipalities to reduce a fifth of their load compared to, say, farmers, which actually have about 40 to 60% of the reduction. So it was evenly divided up how much you're contributing, is that's your share that you need to, in fact, to reduce. You're right that in Maryland and Virginia, for example, they're also bringing state cost share programs to the place so that the burden is not so much on the individual municipalities, but it's shared among all the people living in the Chesapeake part of the watershed in Maryland, Virginia. Certainly that's something that Pennsylvania is starting to move forward with, bringing some Bond Act money and the legislature acting on bringing funding, not just to clean up the individual sewage treatment plants for the Chesapeake, but age-old infrastructure issues, combined sewer overflow issues that are Pennsylvania specific, that are hitting local municipalities, but also that will benefit the Chesapeake.
And of course, septic systems are worse than sewage systems.
Certainly, and for the most part, they don't reduce nitrogen flows. And again, that nitrogen is into the groundwater, and oftentimes we drink either out of the groundwater, out of local streams and rivers, the Susquehanna being a major source. It eventually comes back and hits us directly, not just our neighbors downstream.
So is it a hard sell, getting people to try to do their fair share?
Certainly in these economic times, whether you're talking to a farmer who he or she is working their lands, we're asking an extra piece from them, or somebody that needs to upgrade their septic system, or somebody whose sewer rates may be doubling in a particular area. But again, the benefit comes first locally to that local stream, to their local drinking water where they recreate, but it also helps their downstream neighbors address a problem that we've been seeing in the last 20, 30 years in the Chesapeake.
You wanted to add something to that?
Well, it's a unique situation in Pennsylvania for a number of reasons. One is we have such a lot of wastewater treatment plants that run the gamut from being very small to very large, so there's different economies of scale. We're also, those plants initially weren't designed to do this work. Nutrient treatment was not part of the initial plan designs, which increases the cost as you try to add a new function to the plant. And Pennsylvania is a state with tremendous infrastructure problems across the board. We've got an aging infrastructure. We've not been spending money to both keep it up, and that varies. Some facilities have done a wonderful job. Some haven't touched their system in 30 years, literally. So we have more need in terms of those basic upgrades before we can even get to the nutrient upgrades. So it is difficult. The legislature has just this past year passed a $600 million bond and a $400 million referendum bond to begin to help. It's understandable that a lot of local communities are very concerned about those sorts of costs, especially in the fiscal climate we have right now.
Let's talk for a minute about farming, though, in Pennsylvania. Lancaster, Pennsylvania is one of the leading dairy producers in the country and is contributing more to this problem than lots of other areas.
Regarding farming, one of the things that Rich just alluded to was this nutrient trading option that is on the table in Pennsylvania now. Pennsylvania is one of the first states to have a state policy that allows trading, and in this case, it's going to be primarily the municipal sewage treatment plants reaching a certain threshold of treatment to reduce the nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, to the extent that they can. And if they're still short of the mark and they've exercised all the technological improvements that they can feasibly exercise, then they can actually ask farmers to reduce nutrients above and beyond what the farmers expected to reduce the nutrients by. So in Lancaster, we're actually seeing some of these nutrient trades take place. An example is that the Mount Joy wastewater treatment plant has a nutrient trade with a farm that is actually taking a couple different practices. I think manure exportation is one of the practices that they're getting credit for, along with cover crops, which help manage nutrients by increasing uptake of nitrogen in the soils and holding it in the soils, as opposed to making the nitrogen available for release to the streams under storm events. So we're seeing policies emerge that actually are going to help kind of address the questions that are brought up about how these sewage treatment plants are going to accomplish what they need to accomplish. In some cases, it's going to be possible for sewage treatment plants to meet their increased thresholds for nitrogen and phosphorus reductions by working with the farms, for the farmers to actually do more above and beyond what the farmers are expected to do. There's not a, I just want to say that it's not anybody getting away with doing less. It's the nutrient trading programs requiring both the municipal treatment plants and the farmers to do, to accomplish to a certain level in their nutrient reductions, and then anything they do above and beyond that is what they're allowed to trade.
When you do something, the same thing that you do to protect the bay in terms of nutrients and sediments has enormous local impacts. Those are the same things that are impacting stream health at a local scale. And I think one of the challenges is to be able to describe to people, what is the local benefit? I mean, in your backyard, what are you getting out of these actions that you may have initiated because of the bay?
But what kinds of benefits might homeowners in Pennsylvania see if they adopt these practices?
Improved stream health. I mean, you would see fish community, macroinvertebrate communities, those types of things. And so the local best management practices, or BMPs, that farmers or urban areas put into place have almost immediate and very local benefits in terms of, better fishing, fishable, swimmable, better for recreation, all those types of things.
Patty, can I add to that from a farm perspective? The nutrients that the farmer has are a resource for the farmer. They don't want to lose them to the stream because they need it for the crops to grow. They need, these are the same nutrients that are part of their farm process. So one thing that's really important to remember is that the more that we can help the farmers retain these nutrients on site, the better it is for their farm operation and the better it is for the local environment. And they know that. They don't want to lose the topsoil, which is a really valuable resource to them. And it's just really important that, as we're driving around the countryside, that we are aware that for the farmer, the greatest assets that they have are the natural resources that they're stewarding. And that includes the grains that they're feeding the animals. They want to make sure that they get the formula right so that there's not too many nutrients in that formula, so that those nutrients don't come on the back end, out the back end of the dairy cow and have the increased potential of being released to the environment. And one other thing I want to add to the points Denise made is there's a common misconception that we in the public have that farmers aren't regulated in Pennsylvania. And that, in fact, is not the case. Farmers, no more than any other enterprise, farm enterprises are not allowed to have direct discharges to streams. They have to have erosion and sedimentation control plans. And there are thresholds that they're expected to meet, no matter what the size is. Some of the bigger farms have even bigger requirements in that they have permits with the state that provide further provisions. But every farm in the state has a requirement under state law not to pollute the local streams.
And one of the things they want to know is, will no-till and will cover crops and will feeding dairy cows in a different way really impact the stream? And I want to get back to that in a moment, but first take this question. Go ahead, please.
I'd like to know a little bit more about some other influences like urban development, as the first question, and as a second question about the recent boom in Pennsylvania recently with the natural gas drilling and how that's affecting our downstream waters with water quantity and with water quality.
In a lot of the work that's been done, when you look at the runoff per acre from urban lands and manicured lawns and those sorts of environments, you see greater loads than even agriculture. So an urban environment is a high nutrient load, nutrient pollution environment, and the costs of managing these issues on farmland are far less than managing them in an urban environment. Managing stormwater effectively, working around natural systems, wetlands, forest buffers, and our streams is much more difficult and expensive. So the growing urban sprawl, both south of the Mason-Dixon line and particularly just north of it in Adams County and south central Pennsylvania is of real concern.
If you look in the last 10 years, from 1990 to 2000, across the 6-state watershed, we had an 8% increase in population. At that same time, we had a 41% increase in what we call impervious surface, like blacktops, roofs, etc. So for every person, we were bringing in extra Home Depots and Walmarts, etc., so that ground could no longer absorb that water. And somebody might say, that impacts my local stream, but I know up here in the Susquehanna we have concerns about flooding. So every gallon of that water that ends up going into our streams during a heavy rainflow is not getting absorbed into that ground, also influences whether we're going to see that rising water down along the Harrisburg waterfront or up in the rivers and streams themselves. So that change in how we actually, the whole water running off of our local streams or our local parking lots really has an influence on us.
We often think that one of the primary problems about the bay is runoff. But really the way we've changed the hydrology of the system matters a lot. And this is part of the problem with delivery of water off of impervious surfaces. And so if, for example, you have an intact wetland on the side of a stream, it really can't do anything for you when you have a storm and water is just barreling down the channel. Nothing's going to help you that. And so a lot of the problems with urban development are really this hydrologic modification or modification to the way that the amount and the delivery of water through the system. And so there are watersheds in southeastern Pennsylvania where if you sort of tag the sediment and you see where the sediment's coming from, it's not coming from runoff. It's mobilization of the stream bank, scouring of the bottom. And so you're delivering things in an entirely different way.
Well, lots of people are acknowledging that we are making real inroads in the wastewater treatment and in farming, but the development is one that we're not really pushing enough.
The question asker just mentioned the Marcellus Shale and the natural gas development. One of the unintended consequences that may be positive about the Marcellus Shale is that you sure have seen those for sale signs on farms come down across the border because people are holding on to their land, and consequently that land isn't being converted to other land uses that might, include development or, commercial enterprises. And in some ways, for the moment, that's made it possible for those ag lands and farmlands that are in the Marcellus Shale area where the natural gas exploration is taking place, it's made it possible for them to continue to provide the ecological services that those lands, by virtue of not being paved, not being impervious surfaces, can provide. They can still be great open spaces that improve infiltration of water into the groundwater sources, and it's just, that is one positive aspect that we know about the Marcellus Shale right now, is that land's not changing land use.
Except that we know it will take lots of water to extract the gas.
Well,
that's an issue.
There's very limited. Acting Secretary of DEP John Hanger just testified to the Senate that it would take an additional 60 employees to effectively monitor and enforce the amount of oil gas drilling that we have going on right now. And between water withdrawals that have already become an issue, discharges, whether intentional or not, and just the erosion and sediment control around the large drilling pads, there's a tremendous potential for energy, and we're not terribly well set up as a state to handle it yet.
A lot of challenges. Go ahead, please, sir.
Could you give a ballpark estimate of about how much of Pennsylvania, for example, is wetlands, and what is the rate of decrease? In other words, how much have we lost and how much are we losing presently?
The state has a little less than 800,000 acres of wetland. As I said before, we actually permit less than 75 acres per year. So we don't actually lose too much to development anymore. Most of the wetland, or over 50% of the wetland resources of the state, are actually up in the northeast and the northwest corners. So around here, it's about 4 to 5% of the land area. So, we've done a good job. We don't have as much wetland area as Virginia or Maryland, so we tend to be really careful, I think, about it, and so we don't permit nearly as much. And actually, since 1990, I think there's been about 3,700 acres restored or added. Now, we can talk about acreage versus how well it's functioning. And that might be the conversation that we'd like to move to. In other words, if you just look on an acreage basis, we're doing okay. We're doing pretty well. The question then becomes, how is it functioning? Is it functioning in the way it should? And so wetlands have this suite of natural things they do in terms of flood control, nutrient reduction, sediment reduction, habitat. And if you look across the state at how we're doing, really over, from some preliminary estimates we have, over half of our wetlands are really in fair or poor condition. They're not quite functioning the way they should. And that's something we have to think about now in terms.
What would it take to improve our wetlands?
I think probably attention to the things that we call them stressors that don't allow them to function the way they should be. So we see, for example, you don't have to assume that a wetland in an agricultural setting is not functioning well. We've seen wetlands in agricultural settings that are functioning quite well. Well, it might be because people are paying attention to whether they're ditched or they're drained, or they're receiving too much sediment or too much nutrients. So I think Pennsylvania actually is one of the few states that's doing statewide condition assessment monitoring. In other words, they're going through and reporting on the condition of their wetlands to get an idea of how well are they functioning. That's quite extraordinary, and we're about 3 years into a 5-year process of that. And then once we learn about that, I think we can really identify the things we can do to elevate their functioning or elevate their condition without necessarily having to create more, but taking what we have and improving its functioning.
We look at wetlands as something you want to plow under because we've always looked at them as an unattractive swamp, not as something that really has value, and I think that still exists.
Yeah, Patty, if you look at the just Chesapeake Bay watershed, say that was a person, and in Pennsylvania, the wetlands are your kidneys. They're protecting you. They're allowing you to sort of take out those foreign substances in your body. Well, if you're losing part of your wetlands, you're losing part of your kidney function. So every time you do that, you put a new development in there, that you bypass your kidneys because you're taking that stream and just putting that water right into the stream. You go down to the Chesapeake, it gets even worse. Our oyster populations are at 1% of what they were historically. So you got a Chesapeake ecosystem functioning on sort of a quarter of the kidney. Pennsylvania may be on half to 3/4 of it. No wonder that the streams in the Susquehanna aren't healthy, much less the Chesapeake. Our own sort of natural filtration system's just not working.
I want to get back to the oysters in a minute, but take this question first. Go ahead, please.
I have two questions. The first question relates to wetlands, and the second question is about our personal responsibility. So my first question is, when you hear the news about what's happened with the impact of hurricanes, for example, in the Gulf area and along the East Coast, they talk a lot about the loss of wetlands as increasing the ferocity of the storms and the impact on people through flooding, et cetera. So I'm wondering, as my first question, is something like that happening here with the loss of our wetlands and in terms of making weather more deadly to us or more harmful? And the second is, during the summer here, I live in State College, and we had a huge drought here. We had a drought in my neighborhood that, for example, was so bad that trees were losing their leaves. So we then, in the middle of that drought, had a huge rainstorm. And I live this is a very hilly city, and I live in an area where it's going up a big hill to get there. And as I was walking home from work, the water was just gushing down the blacktop on the road I was walking on, and I was just thinking, I have got to find a way. I live at the top of that hill, so I don't have to worry about flooding, but I was wondering, what can I do to save some of that water so that it's not going to be gushing down the hill? And what can my neighbors do who live farther down and are more at risk of flooding?
Let's start with the wetland.
Yeah, I can address the first part of that. They do play a role because wetlands play a role in actually flood control. And if you ask most people around here, their concept of what the importance of restoring wetland or saving wetland is, it'll be flood storage. So there are these areas on the side of the stream that are like big sponges, and the water comes down, it goes over bank, it sits in these areas. So it takes the top off the flood peak, it holds the water, and then releases it more slowly, like a sponge would. And so flood control is a big function of wetlands, and probably to people around here, probably the most important function. So certainly loss of wetlands has a huge impact on downstream flooding, both the severity and the frequency of that flooding.
Oh, I'm sorry, you.
Yeah, especially you asked an excellent question of what can you do on your local property. A lot of folks say, I'm only one of thousands or millions of people to do that. If you look at your property, you've got downspouts off your roof. The first question is, how can I save that water? Either through a rain barrel, or I actually can put my downspout in there and actually drain it into the groundwater itself so that your trees can actually drink up that water that you're now losing down there. You look at your lawn and how it's setted. Can you actually put a rain garden in place? You look how much can you put pervious pavers or impervious pavers as opposed to an asphalt driveway in there as well. So there's a bunch of things folks can look at their own water budget around their house and say, how can I retain all that water for my local shrubs and plants? Or if I'm on a drinking well, how can I actually get that water so that it'll come back and be something I can drink in a couple years?
There's also opportunities to advocate with your local planning commissions and local governments to adopt more low-impact development kind of guidance so that, as additional development comes into the community, that there are certain measures that are being included. In some cases, simply by having cuts and curbs or no curbs at all, you increase the ability of the swells of vegetation next to drives, ability to absorb rainwaters. And so I think, you happen to live in a community that's pretty progressive about that, and I think citizen advocacy for low-impact development's a really important process too.
Pennsylvania is finally moving forward in the stormwater realm from a policy standpoint too, and I think our new guidance documents and implementation is really emphasizing decentralization of that water. The old style of stormwater was to get it all together in the pipes as quickly as possible and blast it through our streams. And now there's a much greater focus on infiltration starting at an on-lot level, whether that's rain gardens or rain barrels, green roofs, keeping trees on the landscape to absorb more water, and actually trying to minimize the amount of water that's running downhill, period, so you have less to deal with at the bottom of the hill. And it's been a long time coming here, but I think what you're going to see in new communities is going to be a dramatic improvement from what we've seen in the past.
Before we get too far afield from the oyster question, I want to ask you something about that, and then we'll get to the question from our audience. You talked about oysters as being the kidneys for the bay, and we are now at historic lows. At one time, we had enough oysters in the bay to filter the water of the entire bay in 3 days, if I read it correctly, and now with the remaining oysters, it may take more than a year to filter all the water. But I want to talk a little bit about that, but also about some thinking that maybe we ought to be importing oysters from Asia. And I have to say that worries me because there are always unintended consequences. But I know the value of the oyster, so tell us what you can about the situation.
Certainly, as I said earlier, unfortunately, we're at about 1% of the historic populations out there. If you look at in the 1880s, you saw piles of oyster shells as they were taking out there. So it was a huge economic driver in the Chesapeake itself. Unfortunately, a combination of disease, over-harvesting, and pollution have continued to make the oyster decline to the point we're still harvesting right now, but only at a 1% of what we've seen out there. As I said, that when you lose all of a sudden that important kidney, or 3/4 of your kidney there, you've got to figure out, I can only barely live with that much of a kidney. I've got to figure out how I replace that. Unfortunately, folks have been saying, well, I can't do the disease issue, then perhaps look at an Asian oyster or a foreign oyster. Folks are our scientific community is saying, step in this direction very carefully. There are not a lot of good examples of where you brought in a different species, a gypsy moth, whole host of different places where they don't have natural predators. They're in a environment that is foreign to them, and they have consequences that were unintended. We've
reduced catches on some fish, and that's worked. Is that something that's being done with oysters?
Right now, no. We still don't have a complete moratorium. An example of that was with the rockfish or striped bass,
right,
where in the 80s and 90s, Maryland and then followed by Virginia put an absolute moratorium, said you cannot harvest any more rockfish. We had to give it about 6 to 8 years for the rockfish to naturally come back to a point, and then we heavily regulated that fishery. So recreational fishermen, watermen, folks going out on charter boats have a certain amount of catch they can do that's very limited now. But in fact, we have a fishery that we almost lost, 20 years ago.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. Go ahead, please.
Yes. The degradation seems to be coming from very diffuse sources like homes and actions of individual peoples, but also very concentrated sources like sewage treatment plants and farms. And the sewage treatment and farm issue seems to be amenable to technology. Is there any advanced technology coming along that can help reduce the degradation?
Good question.
Yes. And in fact, there are folks in the audience here who could tell you a lot about things that are happening, like at the University Area Joint Authority. That's kind of the cream of the crop in sewage treatment in Pennsylvania. But in thinking about the farm practices, interestingly, there are very simple, basic measures that some farms could put into place that would have huge consequences. And those measures would be everything from establishing stream bank fencing to ensure that livestock are not getting into the creek and increasing erosion of the banks, or manure getting to the creek, using the cover crops, establishing the forested riparian buffers that Matt suggested, the no-till. We talked about, the farmers actually in Pennsylvania, almost 50% of the acres in Pennsylvania in the Bay are under no-till practices now, which simply means that the farmer's not plowing any longer. They're able to plant without actually turning over the soil, which is a huge land disturbance that increases the sediment nutrients getting to the creek. With those baseline practices, there are technological tweaks that have even greater opportunity for reducing the amount of nutrients getting to the creeks. And for instance, would be in a no-till environment, one of the one of the challenges is that the farmer that does have manure that wants to use the manure to fertilize the fields, in a no-till environment, that manure would go right on top of the no-till, and it makes it a lot more likely that it would be washed off to the creek. And one of the technological fixes that Penn State's actually working on is how to inject the manure in a no-till environment so that you don't have a plowed field, and you do a better job of making sure that the nutrients in the manure are getting into the ground and into the root uptake zone. Likewise, with the cover crop situation, there are researchers who are looking to develop practices that would use even better nitrogen fixing kind of cover crops that would ensure that that nitrogen is staying in the ground and increasing its uptake within the soils and decreasing its availability to being emitted into the environment. And so a lot of tweaks to these basic practices for the agriculture. For the sewage treatment plants, would anybody else like to respond to what kind of technology?
I think there are certainly technologies to deal with the wastewater treatment coming out of small, large facilities. I think the big problem is you're mentioning is it's our city streets, our suburban neighborhoods, our commercial developments out there. We talk about low impact development. That still means that you're having an impact on your local streams, your local rivers and stuff. We've got to figure out how to go no impact. In other words, next time you see a Walmart or a Home Depot, do they have a green roof? Do they not just plow down the entire set of trees that were there and put a huge asphalt surface out there? Did they in fact have rain gardens in their own places where they would normally park cars out there? In your urban, suburban areas, we got to think differently about the main street that we've got with gutters and large sidewalks and everybody getting that water off their lawn as quickly as possible because they want to have it green. There are not the same kind of technological engineering fixes or practice fixes like we have for farmers yet for our developing lands, which are not only in Pennsylvania but across the watershed, are the only real source that's actually increasing in terms of nutrient and sediment pollution, that's having more impact on the amount of runoff versus our farm fields and wastewater treatment plants are actually reducing their footprint on our local streams.
Okay, we've got a question from the floor. Go ahead, please.
Here in the Spring Creek watershed, which is headwaters to the Chesapeake Bay, we have a whole variety of community-based groups that are doing individual projects, that are working in partnership with each other to do a whole variety of things, from education to the monitoring of the water resources. So my question is, in your experience, what are the best or the most critical projects or practices that community groups can be doing in their local communities to support restoration efforts in the Bay and to be increasing the local benefits in their own communities?
One of the things that this community has been really successful about has been about engaging folks who may not have otherwise come to the table. And certainly in every watershed, there are folks who have land management responsibilities who need to be pulled into these local organizations, whose thoughts and philosophies need to be incorporated into watershed planning. And that goes from the farmer to the golf course manager to the local municipal official. And I think watershed by watershed, if every watershed had what the Spring Creek watershed community has in terms of an engaged citizenry that was responding and keeping an eye out to the various impacts of all of these sources, we would see a huge improvement in the Bay. And
so
really,
how to get those started?
Do you want to? Oh.
Well, I just wanted to add that you mentioned monitoring, and I think that plays a really important role. And so one of the things that the Chesapeake Bay Program Science and Technical Advisory Committee, in combination with the Bay Program, is trying to do is a large part of that feedback is you start an activity and then somebody ought to be telling you whether it's working or not, right? And we haven't done a very good job at moving up into the watersheds and saying, okay, what you're doing here, you're having a big impact, you know, keep it up. Or the alternative is, it's not working, we need to change what we're doing. And so I think part of the scientific challenge is people do great things at a watershed scale, at about the scale of the Spring Creek watershed. That's where successes are. You know, sometimes when it gets bigger than that, if you talk to people about we're trying to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, people shut down, that's too big. But, you know, the size of the Spring Creek watershed, great things get done. And I think it's important to say we really need to tell people when they're making progress.
Yeah, certainly. You asked the question of what local folks can do. I would say sort of on two tracks. First, preserve that remaining kidney, that function that's out there. Can you buy up land? Can you put conservation easements in place? Can you help your local landowners, whether they own a small forest tract, they own a productive farm? Keep those working lands working for the community and for the mother nature out there. The second piece is protect those local streams. Put in riparian forest buffers, get plantings along there, or grass filter strips. Keep the cows out of the stream, keep them watered and on the pasture and healthy there as well. I think those are two immediate pieces. And third is get your neighbors out there. You all in Pennsylvania have got some fantastic resources. Being a trout fisherman, I'd cross over that border every once in a while because you have some of the finest trout streams in the world up here, all the way through from this area down south there as well. And part of that is keeping that clean water, keeping those banks healthy, and keeping folks connected to their local streams.
You'll find in practically every county conservation district that there are watershed specialists whose job it is to serve as a liaison and a first point of contact with local communities around watershed organizations' development of their mission. And so, the watershed specialists actually are working with a number of watershed organizations within a county. Like in central Pennsylvania, Center County, there are probably half a dozen watershed organizations that are working on several small watersheds. So,
okay. There's some very long-range, serious threats potentially to all of our waters coming from two different sources. One is the salt that is being used on the roads. The second long range is the pharmaceuticals and the endocrine disruptors. We don't have a plan for where we take our unused medicines and the hospitals and the larger institutions that have all this. We need to have more research on this and also a strong effort of finding out who does know some of these answers and what are they doing regulation-wise.
Very interesting, and we are seeing evidence of endocrine problems in aquatic life and fish of all kinds in the bay.
Yeah, unfortunately, in our own rivers, in the Potomac River, the Shenandoah, and even a little bit in the Susquehanna the last couple of years, concern of when you've got a female turning to a male or male turning to a female in terms of a fish or a frog. I mean, talk about a real concern about these are the waters I'm drinking, these are the waters my kids are fishing in. You've got certainly a concern, and it's something that we hadn't anticipated going in there. And as you say, both it's us individually, all of us use medicine one way or another. What do we do after that? Do we have public education about how the best way to do that? And when it gets into our sewage treatment plants, have we been thinking not just about local sewage treatment plants, but actually getting them out of the waste stream?
Well, is the Chesapeake Bay Program or the Chesapeake Bay Foundation working with someone about safely disposing of pharmaceuticals? I mean, is that part of your discussions?
It hadn't been in the past, but that certainly is now, that our streams and rivers are actually, we're seeing that in there, and we're seeing the effects in that. Yes, we're starting to take a look at that.
Okay.
The historic focus has been about nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment.
We need to expand.
And these things are more complicated and probably more grassroots in terms of solution, because I think if you want to watch wastewater treatment plant folks get concerned about costs, nitrogen is nothing compared to pharmaceutical treatment. And we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that before it hits those plants, because there's no way we're going to be able to afford to do it there.
Tentatively, the EPA and other groups have asked to push back the cleanup date from 2010 to 2020. And to double efforts in the next 10 years. Some say that we probably really won't have a great handle on this until 2030. And so I'm wondering, I want to use a quote from a piece I read in National Geographic, which says that public efforts to save the bay, quote, often seem like the estuary itself, impressively broad but deceptively shallow. And I'd like you to all give your take-home message, what each one of us might be able to do to really make this stick, make something really happen.
I think that my take-home message is that what is good for your local watershed is good for the bay. It's not different. What you do to make your piece of the world a better place is not different than what is going to help the bay. And so it's just attention to that's the scale you want to think about. And if you do your job in your corner of the world, the bay will follow suit.
Matt?
The Bay Foundation's overwhelming, I think, frustration with the efforts to date is the pace. We've known about the ag improvements, the basic ag improvements we had to make for 30 years. And we spent a lot of time arguing about how much and who, and instead of just, you know, putting our shoulders into the harnesses and getting moving and getting things done on the ground. We're very concerned about delays. Obviously, we're not going to make the goal. I think it's been broadly acknowledged. Whether we need another 10 years or 5 years, I think there's some question about the level of effort and our seriousness about it. I think probably the most important thing that we do now is that we make sure whatever plan we have and whatever deadline we do choose, whether it's 5 years out or 10 years out, is that it's much tighter, much more enforceable, and that we have responsibility for people who say we're going to do things. We said we were going to clean it up by 2010, and the reality is we didn't allocate the resources necessary.
You're here on that.
So.
Kristen.
I just would like to conclude by saying that we're seeing a lot broader partnerships forming, and partnerships have always been key to any kind of success with water quality improvement. And you know, the Bay Foundation, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, particularly the Pennsylvania office, has really perfected, I think, building local partnerships for moving forward. But what we're seeing that's different are some less likely partners that have always been there, but are now also carrying forward the message that's going to be needed for making the impact. And a great example is, you know, in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau is, you know, they have an environmental director. That person is working on the farm-to-farm kind of approach to encouraging conservation practices. We have a state natural resources conservation service, state conservationist who's very progressive about how to take Farm Bill funds to really target into some of the most problematic watersheds so that we have some places that we can put our finger on the map and say, here in Pennsylvania is the watershed where we were able to show that the nutrient reductions resulted in an improvement, and it's no longer impaired, it's no longer degraded. And then work on that watershed to watershed to watershed. We have to have some of these geographic successes, and I think with these emerging partnerships that are building on some of the past successes that have been more fragmented successes, by packaging it all together and doing an integrated approach, we're really going to have some successes that will help us move forward.
Rich?
It's unfortunate it's taken us several hundred years to get where we are, and it's been a sort of a quarter century working away, and I, like others, are frustrated with the pace of what you've got out there. But I think it's not going to just take EPA. It's not going to just take the 6 states. It's not going to take the efforts of 1,650 local governments. It's not going to take the 88,000 farmers we've got across the 6-state watershed. It's going to take different decisions by most of those 16.7 million people living somewhere in the watershed, either close to the bay, on the Juniata, up on the other small creeks and rivers throughout Pennsylvania, making different decisions about what they do day to day, how they raise their voice, whether they move forward with something progressive. Do they help out on a particular local watershed group? Do they take a personal action and make a difference in their small watershed?
Well, it's going to be a shared sacrifice, and that's for sure. And that is, unfortunately, all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests, Kristen Saki-Blunk. She is Director of Penn State's Agriculture and Environment Center. Matt Earhart, Executive Director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Pennsylvania. Rich Batuk, Associate Director of Science at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Chesapeake Bay Program Office. And Denise Heller-Wardrop, Associate Director of the Penn State Cooperative Wetlands Center. And for all of us here at Penn State Public Broadcasting, I'm Patty Satalia. Thanks for joining us. Have a good night.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU. A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2030. 2111.